On an airfield in Minnesota, a sentry spots an intruder. Fighters scramble, armed with atomic weapons, ready to wage the last war on Earth. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, mankind came closer than ever to wiping itself off the planet, and the world watched and held its breath. But what about all the other times when we were in the dark? Time and again, we faced nuclear holocaust and never even knew it. Today, the danger isn't over. Tomorrow could be Doomsday. We're all living under a cloud. The chance that through war or terror or accident, we could die in a nuclear holocaust. We know how it looks, because once it actually happened. But they never knew what hit them. In the summer of 1945, Japan was still fighting World War II. But it hadn't touched the people of Hiroshima. Suddenly, at 8:16 a.m., they were blinded by a flash of light. Then, they were gone. Bodies were burned. Shadows remained. Grisly X-rays of a new kind of death. The Japanese were warned a new super weapon would be unleashed against them unless they surrendered. Now, 100,000 were dead or dying from a single bomb with the power of 12,000 tons of TNT. August 6th, 1945 was Doomsday, the dawn of the nuclear age. Apocalypse. Sudden, utter destruction was once a myth. Now, it was a nightmare. What happened to the Japanese could happen to anyone who crossed the one nation that wielded the ultimate weapon. In 1945, the United States had 3 atomic bombs. In 4 years, its arsenal mushroomed to 170, and it had a new enemy to use them against. Toward the end of World War II, the Germans retreated from Eastern Europe, and the Soviets stormed in. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany, all fell under a dictator to rival Adolf Hitler, leader of the second most powerful country on earth, Joseph Stalin. In the most powerful country on earth, one man dreamed of stopping him: America's Iron Eagle, General Curtis LeMay.
To us, the only difference between peace and war is where we place our bombs.
LeMay was an operational commander of the Air Force, a like of which we perhaps have never seen. LeMay wanted to ensure that if there was a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, that the United States would strike as effectively, as quickly, and as devastatingly as possible.
America's nuclear arsenal was controlled by the Air Force's Strategic Air Command, or SAC, because the only way to get an atomic bomb to its target was by dropping it out of an airplane. And the head of SAC was Curtis LeMay.
We knew that LeMay was one of those who would always be ready to strike the Soviet Union. So when he became the highest commander of the strategic forces, he was taken very seriously as an enemy.
To LeMay, who lost thousands of pilots over Japan, the bomb was a lifesaver. For America, it was a nuclear insurance policy against the Russians. They didn't have the bomb. Some thought they never would. On September 19th, 1949, one of the most powerful men in America hadn't a care in the world. David Lilienthal, head of the Atomic Energy Commission, was vacationing in Massachusetts on Martha's Vineyard. As he and his wife returned from a party that night, a man stepped into the road. It was Air Force General James McCormick.
I need to talk to you.
Huddled over a kerosene lamp, McCormick made his midnight report. Lilienthal later called it a whole box of trouble. When he finally came to bed, his wife asked what was wrong. He simply replied, "One of those things." The next afternoon at 3:45, Lilienthal broke the news to President Harry Truman. The Air Force had detected radioactivity 20 times normal off Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. Truman shook his head and asked, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" Joseph Stalin had the bomb. Curtis LeMay knew what to do about it. At the slightest provocation, he'd wipe the Soviet Union off the face of the earth.
LeMay was a strong believer in applying all force possible if the bell rang, and he made no bones about it. He's the person you love to hate.
To Truman, a sneak attack on the Soviets would be as despicable as the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He refused. There is only one thing worse than one nation having the atomic bomb, declared an American physicist. That is, two nations having it. The U.S. and the USSR were locked in a new kind of conflict, a nuclear standoff dubbed the Cold War.
All of us lived a very tense life. I think the Americans lived a tense life too. Here in the Soviet Union, we were preparing for nuclear war.
We were quite happy with the fact that America was scared of us. Still, we kept an eye on them, and it was quite a game to play.
America was already working on another bomb, mysteriously called the Super. One physicist dubbed it the Hell Weapon. Inventor Edward Teller called it My Baby. Albert Einstein, a father of the atom bomb, said it shouldn't be built. But the nuclear genie had escaped from its bottle. In the nuclear age, each issue of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists showed a clock approaching midnight, indicating how close the world stood to nuclear war. When Truman approved the Super, the clock was moved up to 3 minutes to midnight. At dawn on November 1st, 1952, on an atoll in the Marshall Islands, the U.S. tested the Super. "40 miles away, sailors witnessed the first star made by man. A fireball, 4 miles wide, capped by a mushroom cloud, rising 25 miles into the heavens. The hydrogen bomb was 1,000 times more devastating than the Hiroshima bomb. Just one could wipe out most of Moscow, Peking, or Washington. Because within 9 months, the Soviets gave birth to their own super. In America, still standing by for doomsday was Curtis LeMay.
Right after the start of the Korean War, LeMay sought authority where he could automatically gain custody of nuclear weapons without presidential authorization. That authority was rejected by the head of the Air Force, General Hoyt Vandenberg, in 1951 as saying it's un-American, it doesn't fit our constitutional procedures.
The U.S. still had a huge edge over the Soviet Union, but how long would it last? Eisenhower authorized a top-secret program to find out. B-47s loaded with cameras would fly into the sovereign territory of the Soviet Union to spy. This was an act of war. The overflights were so sensitive that Eisenhower personally signed off on every one, and the word overflight was never spoken. Within a year, he learned the Soviets were rolling out a new weapon, an intercontinental bomber that could strike Chicago or New York. Alarmed, Eisenhower stepped up the overflights. The Cold War was about to heat up. On the morning of May 8, 1954, Captain Hal Austin took off from a British air base on a top-secret mission. 2 other planes followed. All 3 had orders to fly north of Finland. But Austin's crew had orders to keep going, alone.
I did remember asking the question, well, where are the rest of the guys? Are we going by ourselves? And yes, the other 2 airplanes will turn around at the point 100 miles north of Murmansk and retrace their steps coming back to Fairford. And you'll be going to the south.
600 miles south, inside Soviet airspace, to photograph 9 airfields and learn the exact size of the Soviet bomber fleet. A mission so secret, it wasn't declassified until 1995. Austin knew the Soviets might spot him, but they couldn't touch him. The RB-47 flew higher than any Soviet fighter. The Russians spotted Austin as soon as he crossed the border, and they didn't even need their radar.
All the engines start pouring out these white, it's not smoke, it's just vapor, but all I had to do was look up and see us coming through Russia.
Then, out of nowhere, appeared jets flying as high as Austin. Brand new Soviet MiG-17s.
I don't know of anybody that wouldn't say they were scared to death about that point in time, because all of us were. Once those fighters showed up, we got a little nervous.
Inexplicably, the MiGs flew off. But then, a second squadron appeared, and they did more than just look.
I saw tracers going both above and below the airplane, so there wasn't any doubt that they were serious about trying to knock us down.
Austin's tail guns were guided by radar, the only way to draw a bead on the MiGs.
And then the radar went out, so I felt like I was almost like Wyatt Earp, because I'd have to look at the fighters coming in and move the guns. Occasionally they would burp up, a few more shells would go out.
The guns jammed, but the few rounds Carl Holt squeezed off spooked the MiGs. and probably save their lives. With the last photo taken, Austin headed home. But as he turned, a MiG finally scored a hit.
Shrapnel penetrated our main fuel cell and also took out our intercom.
The Americans were losing fuel. They'd lost their guns, and they couldn't shake the MiGs. Over northern Europe, Soviet fighters chased a U.S. spy plane across Russia, Finland, Sweden. Near British airspace, they finally gave up. Flying on a clipped wing, the Americans coasted to safety.
When we landed and pulled into our parking place, there were probably 50 people standing around waiting, wanting to know what happened, where we'd been, and everything. Of course, we couldn't tell them where we'd been. They could see what happened. We had a big hole in the wing of the airplane.
The next day, Austin's crew flew back to the U.S.
And we were debriefed by General LeMay and his, I don't know how many stars was in that room, but there was all of his senior officers at Psych headquarters. And he started the debriefing by stating that he'd like a complete rundown on the mission as we flew it and remembered it, and that would be the last time we should talk about that mission ever.
Austin never talked until now. Each crewman was awarded 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses for bravery. LeMay also wanted to give them the Silver Star for combat, but that would have blown their mission wide open. When Swedish newspapers reported a bizarre air battle, the U.S. denied it had any planes nearby. Soon after Hal Austin's flight, Eisenhower approved Project Aquatone, a top-secret program to develop a spy plane no Soviet fighter could touch. That plane would fly into a hornet's nest. On April 30th, 1960, shortly after 8 p.m., Eisenhower picked up the phone and issued a single order to a covert American airfield on the other side of the world. Minutes later, in Pakistan, a pilot for the Central Intelligence Agency named Francis Gary Powers took off on the longest ride of his life, a 3,000-mile spy mission across the entire Soviet Union.
At 5 in the morning, I was summoned to the command post at the anti-aircraft center. We could see how the target was moving. None of our means could reach it. The situation was growing very tense. Khrushchev and the defense minister were exchanging phone calls and shouting, "Why can't you shoot down this bloody plane?"
The plane was the U-2. Built for the CIA, it was the greatest spy weapon yet invented. It carried no guns, and it didn't need any. It flew at 70,000 feet, beyond anything the Soviets could throw at it. Its camera could photograph a swath of land 750 miles wide and 3,000 miles long. With such detail, the CIA could read a newspaper headline.
We kept an eye on those planes, and we were quite nervous about them. We certainly knew that these planes came from America, but we couldn't prove it. And we should shoot them down to prove it. It was a very scandalous situation.
Eisenhower had used the first U-2 to see whether the Soviets were ahead in bombers. They weren't. They were ahead in something more frightening. In the fall of 1957, a sphere the size of a beach ball orbited the Earth every 96 minutes and anyone with a good pair of binoculars could see it. It was mankind's first satellite, Sputnik. Sputnik itself was harmless. But the same missile that boosted it into space could carry a hydrogen bomb to Washington. It was an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, and the United States, the most inventive nation on Earth, didn't have it. Russians were ecstatic. The world was awed. America scrambled to catch up. A presidential commission secretly urged building bomb shelters to protect every single American. Eisenhower rejected the idea as too costly, but if war came, he admitted there wouldn't be enough bulldozers to scrape the bodies off the streets. 15 months after Sputnik, the U.S. launched its first Atlas ICBM. The arms race entered the missile age. Whether the U.S. was winning the race was the mission of Francis Gary Powers. A third of the way across the Soviet Union, Powers' single engine stalled in the thin air. To restart it, he glided down to where the oxygen was richer. 50,000 feet, 40,000, 30,000. A week later, the Soviets announced they'd shot down an American spy plane 1,000 miles inside their territory. The U.S. denied the aircraft even existed until the Soviets displayed the wreckage.
Defendant Powers.
And the pilot.
Do you plead guilty to the charges listed?
Yes, I plead guilty.
Да, признаю себя виновным.
Powers was traded for a Soviet spy by the new man in the White House. The U-2 revealed fresh trouble right in his own backyard.
We started flying over Cuba because there's all kinds of reports of what the Soviets were doing there.
A right-wing dictator friendly to the U.S. had been ousted by a left-wing dictator friendly to the Soviets. Fidel Castro, Khrushchev's man, in Havana. On October 15, 1962, U-2 photos from Cuba kept Pentagon analysts up all night.
А что если бы мы также поставили ракеты с атомными зарядами, значит, но скрытно, чтобы Соединенные Штаты не знали, потому что если бросить на Нью-Йорк.
We had many thousands of nuclear weapons that we could deliver against the Soviet Union in a matter of minutes to hours. The Soviets had far fewer weapons that they could have delivered against the United States. That's one of the reasons they were installing weapons in Cuba, to try to close this gap.
I approached Khrushchev and said, look, I think this is very risky because the Americans will react very strongly. And he said, well, we aren't doing anything besides what the Americans have been doing for several years now. They have their missiles around us, so we will just equate them in a way.
John F. Kennedy was stunned. In days, the missiles could be launched. In minutes, 17 million Americans could be wiped out. By October 22nd, reporters knew something was up. Kennedy had to break the bad news.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Kennedy announced all Soviet ships bound for Cuba would be stopped and searched for weapons. Any ship that refused would be sunk.
Speed 600 plus. 25 unknown. Kilo Zulu, Whiskey 4.
For the first time ever, the president invoked Pentagon procedures to prepare for nuclear war.
They're called defense condition levels. The lowest level is 5, the highest level is 1. And during a crisis where it was considered that there was a risk, a danger of nuclear war, the level would be increased.
Kennedy moved from Defense Condition 5 to DEFCON 2. B-52s, carrying nuclear weapons, flew to staging points outside the Soviet Union. Each pilot carried more firepower than all the Allied bombers in World War II. To protect its fighters, the Air Force dispersed them to remote airfields, like Volk in northern Wisconsin, so small it didn't even have a control tower. Volk's command post was a base in Duluth, Minnesota. Duluth would tell them if the missile crisis reached the flash point. And on the chilly night of October 25th, it did. A saboteur is infiltrating the Duluth base.
Stop! Who goes there?
The sentry's challenge goes unanswered.
Stop or I'll shoot! Snore 7, come in, over.
This was it.
I got people climbing the fence out here and shots have been fired, sir. Over.
The Russians were coming. 300 miles away at Volk Field, fighter pilots awoke to the sound of nuclear war.
And that was a real rude awakening, to say the least, because we had been told that there wouldn't be any practices. It was real serious if we were going to launch there in the dark of night with nukes on board.
Back in Duluth, the sentry closed in on his saboteur. At Volk Field, the duty officer discovered the false alarm, but he couldn't call back the fighters. Volk didn't have a control tower. At the last second, truck headlights suddenly appeared on the runway. It was the quick-thinking duty officer.
Normally you're always eager to go, but in that particular case, I wasn't bothered by the fact that we turned around and came back.
A nuclear launch was averted in the nick of time, but it wasn't the last heart-stopping blunder of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world.
On October 26, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its 11th day, and the world still held its breath. Around the globe, people were stocking up for Doomsday. The Soviet people were never warned that each minute might be their last, but a few figured it out.
I spent the whole time at the command post, but I called home. And I told my wife, why don't you go and visit my mother in the Ivanova region? And you can imagine I couldn't be too forthright over the phone, but she understood it, and she said, "No, we'll stay here."
In Washington, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was preparing to invade Cuba. He estimated 18,000 men could be wounded or killed. To save American lives, some of Kennedy's advisors proposed destroying the missiles with a so-called surgical strike. The meeting was secretly recorded. The tapes were released only in 1996.
If we go in and take them out of a quick airstrike, there's bound to be a reprisal from the Soviet Union. There always is, which leaves me only one alternative, which is to fire nuclear weapons, which is a hell of an alternative.
In the nuclear age, the deterrent to a surprise attack is the threat of a counterattack. But to counterattack, you need a warning of incoming warheads.
Warning time is critical. It gives you time to get your airplanes off and to kill the other guy before he does too much damage. He may get that first one off, but what he causes is a retaliatory strike that is going to be decisive.
Normally, the Pentagon would have 30 minutes warning, but now, Soviet missiles were just 90 miles from Key West. On October 26th, a radar station in Moorestown, New Jersey, was scanning the skies above Cuba.
Major, I think you better take a look at this.
Suddenly, Moorestown picked up a missile.
What you got?
It looked like the first shot of World War III. Before the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. radar was aimed only over the North Pole, toward Russia.
Even though Cuba was there, we didn't consider it a significant threat, and certainly not a missile threat. And when this occurred, that changed very quickly.
The Air Force took over radar sites used for tracking satellites and pointed them at Cuba. One site was Moorestown, New Jersey. If a missile were launched from Cuba, it would be detected here first. So vital was Moorestown that the Air Force installed a hotline straight to the White House. For technicians who tracked harmless satellites, the hotline was nerve-wracking.
We certainly did not want to, or nor should we, be talking directly to the White House. And we immediately notified our command that someone had ordered a phone directly to the White House, and that's not the way the system normally was established.
The hotline was removed, but at Moorestown, the heat was on.
If that missile is going to Washington from Cuba, it's probably about 10 minutes before it impacts. So now you have 10 minutes in Washington to say Hail Mary or Our Father, because that's not an awful lot of time.
Time was crucial. Kennedy would have just minutes to decide whether to destroy the Soviet Union. The computer needed 30 seconds just to calculate the missile's target.
30 seconds in this case seems an awful long time.
At last, its course was clear. It was heading out to sea. The missile was fired from Patrick Air Force Base in Florida. In the middle of the highest alert in American history, the Air Force was conducting a routine test. It hadn't even warned Moorestown.
As a result of this event, that was corrected and corrected very quickly.
But Moorestown wasn't the only station watching the skies.
That launch could easily have been monitored by the Soviet Union and could have been interpreted as the leading edge of a sudden U.S. nuclear attack.
We were at standby in full combat readiness. There were moments when we really felt, if needed, we would go in a second.
If the Titan missile had looked to the Soviets like a sneak attack, nuclear war could have begun on October 26, 1962. As the Titan disappeared into the Atlantic, 5,000 miles away in the Arctic, another crisis was brewing. Early on October 27, 1962, Chuck Maltzby took off from Alaska on a routine mission to sample the air near Russia for signs of atomic tests. At that very moment, the superpowers were locked in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the gravest threat to mankind since World War II. Yet no one had thought to cancel Maltzby's flight.
History produces revelations every year about the Cuban Missile Crisis and other nuclear crises that indicate that our national political authorities never understood fully what was happening in the field, what our nuclear forces were doing, and what the risks were that those forces might be used without their permission.
Maltzby was flying over the North Pole, where his magnetic compass was useless. Instead, he had to navigate as Columbus did, using a sextant to read the stars. Unexpectedly, the northern lights began to shimmer, and the stars vanished. Then his transmissions to base started to break up.
Saber 1 to Lion's Den, over.
He kind of cut in and cut out,
Saber 1 to Lion's Den.
and it was difficult sometimes to find out exactly what he was saying. But there was cause for alarm because he was well overdue on the time that he should have been back over Alaskan airspace.
Maltzby searched for American frequencies to guide him home. Alone, above the Arctic Circle, Chuck Maltzby was lost.
The first word I had that anything was wrong was a sideband radio message from Chuck saying I should have picked up some navigation frequencies long ago and I can't find them. I need some help.
Moments later, Maltzby's radio crackled to life. The broadcast was Russian. By now, Maltzby's base had lost him.
Well, we got one.
But in Kotzebue, Alaska, the world's most powerful radar was tracking him. Chuck Maltzby had taken a wrong turn. He was in the USSR. The Air Force couldn't help him without disclosing its top-secret radar. All they could do was pray. At Maltzby's base, Don Webster decided to send out a search party. Two hours later, they hadn't found Maltzby. They were low on fuel, and they were heading home toward the rising sun.
For some reason, it just triggered my thoughts to call Chuck and ask him if he could see the sun. And when he replied that he could not, I knew immediately that he was way too far west. So I told him immediately turn 90 degrees to the left. I said, "Do you see the sun now?" And he said, "Yes, I see it right on the nose of the aircraft." And I said, "Don't turn."
But Maltzby's trouble was just beginning.
Воздух, квадрат 41-47, самолет.
В такой обстановке
See, in this kind of a situation, when you are very nervous, you see this target and then you question yourself whether to shoot them down or not. And at the same time, you have to consider that you can provoke quite a conflict by doing that. So notwithstanding all these facts, that the people were tired and their nerves exhausted, our task was to reach this target and to shoot it down.
Scramble, scramble, Alpha Papa 60 and 61.
At the 317th Fighter Squadron, Joe Rogers launched 2 interceptors to the rescue.
We knew he was being pursued. We knew they were trying to get him.
The fighters were armed with air-to-air nukes to shoot down enemy planes.
Once you assume alert status, everything is in readiness to be fired. All the missiles are plugged in and ready to go. The crews realize that they have a major responsibility with that thing they're carrying in the belly, and there's nobody to stop them from using it.
In the Arctic skies, the superpowers steered a collision course to nuclear war. As Maltby's U-2 raced towards safety, Major Rudy Anderson was piloting another U-2 over Cuba. The Soviets spotted him at high noon.
It was just a mistake that was made in a weird situation. A lieutenant general saw the plane and didn't know what to do, so he gave an order to shoot it down. And when they did, Moscow was shocked.
The Pentagon urged President Kennedy to retaliate.
Robert Kennedy came to me. He said, Mr. Ambassador, the president just received information that the Cubans shot down our reconnaissance plane. Our generals demand to return fire for fire. We have many planes, fighters, and they could really knock out all these missiles.
Invasion was the only answer for the Air Force Chief of Staff, the same man who urged 2 other presidents to drop the bomb, Curtis LeMay. As tempers flared in the White House Situation Room, LeMay compared Kennedy's hesitation to Britain's reluctance to stop Hitler.
This is almost as bad as the achievement of nukes. I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now.
LeMay didn't know what was waiting for him. 40,000 Soviet troops and 42 tactical nukes for use right on the beach. By now, both the Soviets and the Cubans were convinced the Americans were about to attack. If they did, Castro demanded his comrades retaliate with everything they had. The Soviet ambassador to Havana was so nervous, he spent the entire crisis in his bomb shelter. The choice between peace and war rested on the shoulders of John Kennedy. 12 miles above Siberia, Chuck Maltby was still racing for home. Suddenly, his lone blip was joined by 2 others, but the Soviets didn't know if they were watching a rescue or an attack.
We could see the whole situation on the board. The phones were ringing constantly, and our commanders were asking questions non-stop. Why is he still there? Why is he still in there? And we had to take him out.
Over the Bering Strait, Maltby finally met his rescuers. The Soviets turned back.
Good thing they never met. The way it happened, the American aircraft managed to flee before the Soviet planes reached this place. The planes that came to help Maltzby had nuclear missiles on board, and that could have been quite an incident if anything happened. When McNamara found out that Americans were there, he was pulling his hair out, shouting, "What are you doing? It means war with the Soviet Union."
Just as he ran out of fuel, Maltzby glided in. When Kennedy found out what happened, he reportedly said, "There's always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word." Kennedy chose not to retaliate for the death of Rudy Anderson. 36 hours later, Khrushchev agreed to remove his missiles from Cuba. Kennedy agreed not to invade Cuba and to secretly remove his own missiles in Turkey. The 13-day crisis was over.
During that 1 week, I lost something like 3 kilos. And when I told that to my wife, she said, "Couldn't you find a safer way to reduce?"
The next time the superpowers met for a showdown, the Soviets would no longer be outgunned. In 1962, the United States was ready to start World War III to rid its backyard of Soviet nukes. Within a decade, each superpower was living with a knife at its throat. Each side now dispersed its missiles around the world, poised for launch at a moment's notice. Each could now launch by land, sea, or air, and each now wielded so many warheads that even if one side struck without warning, the other could utterly destroy it. This stalemate spawned the most terrifying idea anyone had heard of: mutual assured destruction. Today, the danger isn't over. Tomorrow could be Doomsday.
The arms race went on and on, not to frighten the enemy, but to make sure that there is no reason to attack us. These weapons became a weapon to hold them away. It's like having 2 scorpions in a bottle where they cannot fight because they do not have space to maneuver. At the same time, they know for sure they're able to kill each other, and this is why they remain quiet.
By the early 1970s, the most terrifying weapon in the nuclear arsenal was the submarine. 24 hours a day, Soviet subs cruised invisibly off the eastern seaboard and the west coast. Without warning, they could lob warheads onto New York, Los Angeles, or Washington, D.C. A strike so sudden and so precise that it could prevent any retaliation at all. This new strategy was called decapitation. American subs posed the same threat to Moscow. In neither fleet were nuclear weapons equipped with safety locks. In this atmosphere of mutual terror, the superpowers maneuvered for global influence.
In Africa, there was enough for some warlord to say that he was going to build socialism in his country, and the Soviet Union would start providing him with arms, and another warlord would say he was against communists, and the United States would provide him with arms.
And so the game went around the world. The Middle East is the most fought over land on Earth, the home of the oldest feud in history, and the site of a great battle more than 3,000 years ago called Armageddon.
The most dangerous nuclear confrontation period happened during the so-called Yom Kippur War in the early 70s. At that point, the imbalance that had existed between Russia or the Soviet Union and the United States in strategic nuclear missilery had largely disappeared.
October 6th, 1973 was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. That day, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The attackers were armed by the Soviet Union. The Israelis were armed by the United States.
We were flying supplies then from west to east into Israel. And the Russians were flying supplies then from north to south in Cairo, so we were crossing all the time. It was an amusing situation in a sense if it wasn't so serious.
2 weeks later, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire. But 2 days after that, the Israelis took the offensive. In the Sinai Desert, they surrounded an entire Egyptian army. On October 24th, at 9:35 p.m., the Soviet ambassador in Washington relayed a message from Leonid Brezhnev to Richard Nixon, two new players on the nuclear stage.
He sent a letter to him, President Brezhnev, to President Nixon, saying, look here, it looks to us that really Israel doesn't pay attention. Neither to us, neither to you. So you have to use all you have in power. If Israel will continue this aggressive course, maybe we will need to send military contingents from you and from us to stop in order to enforce ceasefire.
The letter didn't end there. Unbeknownst to the rest of the Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, alone and drunk in the Kremlin, added a personal threat. I will say it straight, he wrote, that if you find it impossible to act jointly with us in this matter, we would be faced with the necessity of urgently considering the question of taking appropriate steps. Brezhnev then ordered his paratroops to mobilize for an invasion. Alarmed, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger tried to buy time.
Kissinger was a little bit worried, of course, because he didn't like to have Soviet troops in the Middle East. So he rushed to the president, and then he called me from my telephone and said, look here, President asked to wait a little bit, but we have to think it over.
With no time to lose, Kissinger sat down at 10:40 p.m. in the White House Situation Room with Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, CIA Director William Colby, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Thomas Moorer, and White House Chief of Staff Alexander Haig.
I was there representing the president, who felt that it wasn't appropriate for him to be there just yet.
We reviewed not only the letter, which we regarded as threatening,
the actions of Soviet air, which we could detect through our intelligence capabilities.
As a general practice, if you conduct an airborne operation, you want to drop the troops during the day. We knew that we had about 2 hours, if that, to make a decision.
At 11:41 p.m., they made their decision. They raised the entire U.S. Armed Forces from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 3. At U.S. air bases, B-52s loaded with nuclear weapons lined up nose to tail. In missile silos, launch commanders buckled themselves into their chairs. 2 carriers raced to the eastern Mediterranean, and nuclear-armed submarines sped to secret rendezvous off the Soviet coast, prepared to launch. Henry Kissinger was ready for a showdown.
Now, I don't want anyone to think, this was some wild cowboy who made a wild decision. This was a decision. It was arrived at in a collective meeting of the National Security Council.
Nixon's role that night remains in dispute. Some say the president, mired in the Watergate scandal, was too depressed to come downstairs.
Nixon had started drinking and was drunk. Haig refused to call him to the telephone. So the men authorized a DEFCON 3 alert on their own.
Haig disagrees.
We made the recommendation and decided on the actions that should be taken, and I presented them to the president on the telephone.
We may, because of our concern about the Soviet perception of American paralysis, have taken an action that some would regard as too strong. There was no difference within that room with regard to the need to deliver a powerful message.
The Soviets got the message. They put their own nuclear forces on alert. 200 million Americans were closer to the brink than they knew. Kissinger wanted to spook the Soviets, not his countrymen. So he ordered the move to DEFCON 3 be kept secret. Americans went to bed unaware they were 2 steps away from war. Before they woke up, the secret was out. In the dead of night, a reservist rushing back to his base in Maryland was pulled over for speeding.
So the cop says, "What the hell are you going so fast for?" He says, "We're on alert." And of course that hits the papers, and it was all over the town by daylight.
At 5:40 a.m. in Washington, Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin got a rude awakening. It was Kissinger's reply to Brezhnev. No Soviet troops would be allowed to set foot in the Mideast. In a high-stakes game of nuclear poker, Henry Kissinger had just upped the ante. During the night, Moscow satellites had detected the U.S. alert, but Moscow hadn't told Dobrynin. He found out the same way everyone else in America did, on the morning news.
And it is the ambiguity of some of the actions and communications and certain readiness measures that were observed that caused the President at a special meeting of the National Security Council last night at 3 a.m. to order certain precautionary measures.
I was very angry. I called Kissinger and said, "Henry, what's going on? What kind of alert? Are you going to want war with us?" He said, no. Nothing to do. I said, "Why you put it there?" Well, he said, there was some reason, but it's some domestic reason. But you could tell the President Brezhnev right now that tomorrow a lot will be put away.
Kissinger then proposed sending observers to the Mideast, not troops. Brezhnev accepted.
It was a deliberate overreaction on the part of Henry Kissinger to make quite clear that we were not buckling under Soviet pressure.
Old General Forrester in the Civil War said, whoever gets there fastest with the mostest prevails. And in crisis management, that's the way you've got to play these games, to have the other side reconsider. If you take weak, incremental steps, that has a built-in incentive with it for the other side to match what you're doing and up the ante.
I think it was some people were probably Americans, like to create the impression that they save Middle East, save Israel, and I don't know who else from military intervention from us. There was no intention at all.
It was very tempting for American political authorities to believe that they could follow in the footsteps of John Kennedy and issue nuclear threats. At the same time, the American political authorities underestimated the risks that things could go wrong.
A few years later, in the heart of America, something would go terribly wrong. In a secret room in the middle of America, the North American Air Defense Command looks for trouble around the clock. If they find it, they'll tell the president. But if they're wrong, they'll be making the biggest mistake in history. On November 9th, 1979, they couldn't make up their minds. At exactly 8:50 a.m., NORAD's radar screens were lit up by hundreds of specks streaming across the North Pole.
I show incoming missiles from all over the USSR.
NORAD's duty officer had just 3 minutes to confirm that what he saw was what he thought it was, an all-out Soviet attack.
We have a situation here. Where's that confirmation?
His staff anxiously dialed their radar sites. They hadn't detected any missiles.
Clear can't verify, sir.
As seconds ticked by, the Pentagon's Deputy Director of Operations demanded a report.
I don't know.
And he finally said, if somebody can't explain this to me in 30 seconds, I'm going to convene a missile attack conference.
Sir, I still show incoming missiles from all over the
No one could explain it.
No confirmation from anybody yet.
At Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, D.C., the president's command post for waging nuclear war taxied to the runway. Across the country, B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons prepared for takeoff. Fighters were already scrambling to intercept enemy bombers. It seemed World War III had begun. Hidden deep in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs lies the world's greatest computer system. Its job is to detect incoming missiles and give the president enough warning time to launch a counterattack. This strategy is called launch on warning.
Launch on warning requires assessment of an incoming missile attack 3 or 4 minutes after the attack begins. Requires anywhere from 4 or 5 minutes to perhaps as much as 10 minutes for a presidential decision, and then requires another 5 minutes to retaliate. It's really a very, very tightly scripted operation that allows absolutely no room for mistake, allows very little time for rational thought.
This is no way to go to war. This has surrendered political choice to the machinery.
That day in Colorado, mankind's fate rested with a machine.
We need confirmation.
One by one, radar stations reported to NORAD. None detected incoming missiles. The most sophisticated computer system in the world had sent a false alarm. The Pentagon canceled the alert. The President's command post returned to its hangar. The man now in charge of America's nukes, Jimmy Carter, wasn't even notified. If he had been, he would have had just 5 minutes to decide whether to push the button. The Air Force hurried to bury its mistake.
The hotline at my desk to the command center rang, and I picked it up, and it was the command director who said, we just had this little event happen, and but it's over now, and everything's taken care of, and don't worry about it. And I said, okay, thank you very much, and hung up.
Bruce Brown did worry. He sensed there was more to it than he'd been told. There was. NORAD was about to train radar operators how to detect missile attacks. But no one could get the training tape to work.
So they called back down to the headquarters and said, we can't make it run. And somebody said, go get the J tape and see if that'll run.
Quick alert!
The J tape simulated an all-out nuclear attack on the United States. Worse, the computer reported that this was the real thing. When the Pentagon learned that Armageddon was almost started by a training tape, it tried to suppress the snafu. But when it went on alert, the Pentagon had notified key airports to get ready to clear the skies. At Dulles Airport, a reporter just happened to be in the control tower and overheard everything. Next, the Pentagon blamed the guy who inserted the training tape, but he was just a scapegoat.
That crew should have detected that it was not real. Any attack of that magnitude surely would have been detected by the ground site controlling the satellite that was sending you the warning messages. Like it or not, there are some of us who, no matter how much we train, when faced with the real event, will just freeze.
Imagine if you were in the hot seat at NORAD, and really this was your only job for the rest of your life, and it could only happen one time, and that's that if the enemy launched a sudden attack, you have 3 or 4 minutes to find out what's going on and to notify the president and brief the president when he comes on the line of what you know about that attack. And oh, by the way, don't make any mistakes.
NORAD quickly moved its training to a separate location. The damage to America's credibility took longer to repair.
The Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs were in Brussels at a NATO ministerial meeting. A representative from Brussels got up and sort of said, if this is what being under the American nuclear umbrella means, we just soon go it alone. Because we think the chances of the Soviets attacking from the blue are apparently somewhat less than you cowboys getting it started by accident.
4 years later, it looked like the Cowboys were getting it started right out of the clear blue. On September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 took off from Alaska, bound for South Korea. At 2 a.m., the jet strayed into Soviet airspace. The Soviets decided to take a closer look. "90 minutes later, an American listening post in Japan picked up a single message from a Soviet fighter pilot. Zapustka, missile away. All 269 people on board perished. The Soviets insisted the jet was a spy plane. The rest of the world was outraged.
What can we think of a regime that so broadly trumpets its vision of peace and global disarmament, and yet so callously and quickly commits a terrorist act to sacrifice the lives of innocent human beings?
The Soviets wondered what President Ronald Reagan would do. They soon found out. In 1980, candidate Reagan feared America was trailing the Soviet Union. He pledged to close the window of vulnerability.
So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride.
Upon taking office, Reagan didn't just beef up the military. He stepped up the war of words.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
The evil empire speech alarmed the empire's new leader, a man paranoid about the West. Yuri Andropov. Andropov called Reagan insane and accused him of preparing to annihilate the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union, almost throughout its history, suffered from a paranoid strain in its understanding of the outside world. And what Reagan did was to raise that paranoid interpretation of the United States to dangerous levels.
I think there was a feeling that Ronald Reagan was too ideologically inclined and sometimes not enough educated, if I may say so.
2 weeks after his evil empire speech, Reagan announced his Strategic Defense Initiative. Satellites armed with lasers to shoot down Soviet missiles. To pundits, it was Star Wars versus the evil empire. But Moscow wasn't laughing.
They thought, now if the Americans have a shield against our missiles, then the Americans and the West can take us with bare hands. All right, we will destroy Western Europe, but so what? The United States would remain intact.
Against this backdrop of paranoia, the KGB launched an unprecedented spy campaign, Operation Rion, from the Russian initials for Surprise Nuclear Rocket Attack. Its mission, to look for signs of doomsday. Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB's chief agent in London, received a long list of warning signs.
They said, remember, a preparation to a sudden nuclear attack on us would take the West between 7 and 10 days. They will have to carry out important consultations between the prime ministers, presidents. The preparation will start at the nuclear bases. the American embassy will show a lot of activity.
The KGB believed another clue to impending war would be a jump in the fees offered to British blood donors.
Nobody in the London residency likes to tell Moscow Centre that British blood donors are not actually paid for their blood, because to tell Moscow Centre that might be to suggest that Moscow Centre was ludicrously ignorant of what went on in Britain.
The KGB wanted what it expected. Agents obliged, even when they had to make it up.
You should report about something. If you haven't noticed anything, you are a poor officer. You can be recalled and punished.
In Moscow, nerves were shot. The British knew it because they had a double agent, Oleg Gordievsky. When he revealed Moscow thought nuclear war was coming, the British warned the CIA. They just let Moscow keep sweating. Then, on September 1st, the Soviets shot down KAL Flight 007. In a rare move, the Soviets sent out a Molniya, a flash message warning agents in Western Europe to brace for an American attack. It looked like it was coming. NATO began testing procedures to launch the new Pershing IIs about to be deployed in West Germany. The tests were just part of a war game, and the Soviets knew it. That's why they were so scared.
The contingency plan that the Warsaw Pact, the armed forces of the Soviet Union and its Soviet bloc allies had for a surprise attack on the West was to have an exercise, pretend that it was just a military exercise, but actually use that exercise to begin war in earnest. This was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
The KGB thought NATO had gone on nuclear alert. The countdown might even have started. On November 8th, the Soviet nuclear bombers in East Berlin went on alert. By now, one spark could set the world ablaze. 3 days later, the war game ended. But the Soviets remained jumpy.
So eventually the message went to President Reagan. Do something about it. The Russians are becoming dangerous in their nervousness.
3 months after the war game ended, Ronald Reagan sat down with Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin.
He asked me a very direct question. Mr. Ambassador, does your government believe that I could launch sudden attack against the Soviet Union? My answer was like this one. Said, look here, I don't believe that they believe that you could launch sudden attack, but that all what you are doing looks very convincingly to my government that you're preparing for war.
In time, both sides cooled off. Within a decade, the Cold War would thaw, but another crisis would flare up.
Okay, countdown. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
The 25th of January, 1995, got off to a bad start. In collaboration with the U.S., Norway launched a weather rocket into the stratosphere. The Russians were notified, but their radar teams never got the message.
They could detect that it was a very powerful launch. The height was different from a weather rocket. The starting speed was much faster than a weather rocket. It was an unexpected event.
The rocket's shape and trajectory resembled an American Trident missile, the kind carried by U.S. nuclear submarines. And it was launched from an area thought to be patrolled by U.S. subs. If World War III ever began, Russian radar crews thought they'd be the first to find out. Now it seemed America had just fired the first shot.
So the people on duty found themselves in a very difficult position. If they kept quiet and the rocket landed on Russian territory, then who's to blame? They had to make a decision. They only had a few seconds.
They alerted their commanding general. He, in turn, immediately alerted President Boris Yeltsin via the nuclear briefcase. The briefcase is a remote communications link that lets Russia's leaders fire nuclear weapons at a moment's notice. The President of the United States has a similar device. It's called the football. For the first time in history, an alert had reached the nuclear briefcase. It seemed one American missile was already streaking toward Russia. Before any more were fired, Yeltsin could choose to respond with everything he had, including his most powerful missile, the SS-18, nicknamed Satan. Each carries 10 warheads. One warhead can take out New York City. Yeltsin could destroy every American missile silo and still blanket the rest of the country. On January 25th, 1995, this was the power at Boris Yeltsin's fingertips. Only 5 years before, the world awoke from its long nuclear nightmare. Europe was celebrating the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall, the war's oldest and gravest symbol, was at last coming down. The divided city was united and free. By 1991, Soviet troops, an occupying army for 5 decades, began to withdraw from Eastern Europe. By Christmas of that year, the Soviet Union no longer existed. To stave off bankruptcy, Russia began to cannibalize its mighty war machine. Tank production plummeted by 95%. Officers and troops went unpaid and unhoused. Russia even skimped on gas. To the relief of their old enemy, the Russians ended their submarine patrols in American waters, and they stopped drawing a bead on the U.S.
For the first time since the dawn of the nuclear age, there is not a single Russian missile pointed at America's children.
But it was just a dream. Our nuclear nightmare wasn't over.
Well, the hair trigger is just as dangerous and just as short today as it was 10 years ago. Despite an agreement between President Yeltsin and Clinton to stop aiming missiles at each other, that agreement is more symbolic than real. It takes only 10 seconds to target missiles on both sides. And as for missiles that might be fired accidentally, there is some safety derived from this agreement because a U.S. missile would land in the oceans instead of on a Cold War target in Russia. But unfortunately, the Russians did not re-target their missiles for the oceans. And so an accidental Russian launch would result in a warhead landing in the United States because their system requires that the missile go to its Cold War target if it's fired accidentally.
Also left over from the Cold War was a device for launching missiles automatically. The Russians call it the dead hand system. The Pentagon calls it the Doomsday Machine. In case of nuclear attack, the Russian president can order the general staff to retaliate. That order will ultimately be obeyed, even if no one's left alive to obey it.
The general staff can choose to press a button that fires the weapons by remote control, bypassing people all the way down the chain of command.
A single Russian missile is launched. In mid-flight, it broadcasts pre-recorded launch orders to 4,700 other warheads. It's said God created the world in 6 days. Man can destroy it in 1 hour. On January 25, 1995, Boris Yeltsin faced the greatest decision of any man's life. As an unknown missile soared over Russia, Boris Yeltsin wondered if doomsday had arrived.
There were a few minutes when the president, the defense minister, and the chief commander were quite worried, if not stressed, by the situation. What if it was a real missile? What if it was going to drop on our heads?
Yeltsin chose to wait and see. For 9 minutes, all that stood between the U.S. and annihilation was one man with a drinking problem. Finally, the missile began to reveal its path. It was moving away from Russia. The danger had passed, for now. Boris Yeltsin later speculated that the West was just testing Russia's early warning systems.
Maybe somebody decided to check us out, and we showed them it didn't take a second to find out from where, what speed, and where it's going to land.
Whatever the interpretation, the Norwegian incident is a bleak reminder that Armageddon is still poised on the launch pad. With the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia is no longer the superpower it was, but it still packs a heavy nuclear punch, an estimated 24,000 warheads.
I can easily envisage a situation when the future Russian leader may say, all right, my army is small, I can't invade another country because I don't have the resources.
Пуск.
But my nuclear weapons are numerous and penetrating and accurate, and I will use them instead.
And who will control those nukes? An elected president or a renegade general? Judging by a CIA report leaked to the press, the greater danger is posed by sheer neglect. Russia admits it doesn't track its nuclear stockpiles well enough to know whether anything has been stolen. It's not the bombs that outlaw nations covet, but the uranium or plutonium cores, each as small as a grapefruit. Already, gangsters and terrorists have been arrested trying to smuggle them out. For all the frightening uncertainty of the Cold War, everyone knew who had the bomb and where it was aimed. The Americans and the Soviets were locked in a Mexican standoff, each side afraid to fire first because both had too much to lose. Now, it's every man for himself. The nuclear club is like a fraternity. It's very exclusive, and everyone wants to get in. In 1945, the United States was the only member. Today, 8 nations belong, maybe more. Human nature makes it certain membership will keep growing.
Every invention in the 30,000 years since modern human beings first began to appear on this planet has spread around the world. Now, we can slow down proliferation. We can't prevent it.
As newcomers plan for safeguarding their weapons, they'll look to America and Russia as models.
They will be doing that with the false belief that everything went well during the Cold War and that we did not have the serious false warning incidents, command and control problems, and near accidents.
There's a mathematical principle that if any event has a probability greater than 0, the longer you go and the more trials you have, sooner or later it becomes a mathematical certainty that the event will occur.
More than half a century has passed since that summer day that changed the world. We've grown so used to life with the bomb, we forget tomorrow could be doomsday. Yet the experts say the day may come when a bomb will again fall on some great city. We'll be going to school, going to work, going about our lives, just as on that bright August day in Hiroshima. Like them, we won't be expecting the end of the world. Once more, it will come in the blink of an eye.